In this session, we will look into different ways of using GDP. There are three ways of using GDP. We can use the GDP to measure the living standard. We can use it to measure the economic growth and determine whether an economy is experiencing recession or expansion. First, let's look into how we use GDP to measure the living standard. GDP offers us a way of estimating living standard across both time and countries. GDP does not take into account for population size of the country though. For example, if we look into the GDP in 2016 for China and Germany, in the following table, in the second column, we could see China has a higher GDP in that year than Germany when we don't consider about the population. However, we know that China has a much larger population than Germany, which is why we have to make adjustments by incorporating the population size of the country when we compare these two countries' living standard. How do we get the population adjusted GDP? We're going to calculate the per capita GDP, which is the GDP per person, calculated as GDP divided by population. Now we can get a measure of average living standards in a nation. From the following table, in the third column, we can see for the two countries, when we calculate the GDP per capita, we could find Germany has a higher GDP per capita than China in 2016, which means in the year 2016, the average living standard in Germany was higher than that in China. Then we can calculate the real per capita GDP across country and across time. For example, if we look into this diagram, we could find when we compare across different countries, for example, by focusing on year 2000, the green bar, obviously we could see in 2000 the living standard in United States was highest, followed by Western Europe, Latin America, China, India, and Africa. And also, we can also compare the real per capita GDP along the years. For example, when we focus on United States, we can find along these 200 years, the real per capita GDP in US had been increasing, telling us that the living standard in United States has been increasing along those 200 years. Next, let's look into how we take use of GDP to calculate the economic growth. GDP data can also be used to measure economic growth over time or changes in average living standard. We're going to use the following formula, which is we're going to compare current year's real GDP per capita with previous year's real GDP per capita divided by the real GDP per capita of previous year. And then we can come to the economic growth, which is the percentage change in real per capita GDP. Why do we need to highlight we use the real GDP when calculating the economic growth? Because from our previous small session, we found the nominal GDP could be different from the real GDP. The reason is the nominal GDP was measured in current prices and hence not adjusted for inflation, which means when the nominal GDP increases, it could be attributed to either we are producing more goods and services or the price has been increasing. While in comparison, for the real GDP, when we calculate it, the GDP has been adjusted for the changes in price because we always use the base year's price when calculating real GDP. As a result, if we want to plot the nominal GDP and the real GDP growth on a diagram, we could find, for example, on this graph, the nominal GDP has a higher value than real GDP in every year within this observation period. And their difference is in fact the inflation. All of this just tells us that when we examine the economic growth, we have to adjust the GDP for price change. Which means we have to adjust it for inflation. After we adjust for inflation, then we can take a look at one economy's economic growth. If you look into this graph, we can find that even after adjusting for inflation, the United States economy has been expanding, which has been indicated as an increasing real GDP per capita. Okay, you could see the real GDP per capita is always becoming higher and higher from this graph. The third way of using GDP is we can use GDP to measure the business cycle. We can examine whether our economy is expanding or is in recession. So first, let's look into one concept, which is the business cycle. Business cycle refers to the short-run fluctuations around the long-run trend. For this concept, we're going to give more detailed introduction when we go into the chapter of ADAS. But now let's just remember it is the short-run fluctuation. You will see, if you look into the trend of our economic growth, we can find out different sections. In some section, the real GDP per capita is increasing. We call that part as expansion. Basically, it increases from the trough to peak. Later, I'm going to show the graph. And then in some other sections, the real GDP per capita is becoming less, indicating our economy has been in contraction. Now, let's look at a diagram to find out the expansion and contraction. This is the short-run path showing the business cycle. You could see, if you look into this point, can you see that the real GDP has been at a relatively higher level within some period of time. Basically, it is a peak point. We call that point as peak. This is another peak. And then we find out another point, For example, here it is at the bottom of this curve, meaning the real GDP is at its bottom, which we call as trough. And then we can identify when the real GDP per capita is decreasing from peak to trough, our economy is experiencing contraction because we are producing less goods and services. Our output level is decreasing. While on the other hand, if you look into the section where our real GDP rises from trough to peak, can you see that? The real GDP is becoming more, is growing. We call that period of time as expansion. Our economy is expanding because we are producing more and more goods and services at a faster rate. And of course, this short-run path is fluctuating along the long-run trend of GDP, which we're going to introduce in the later chapters. Now, let's try to practice what you already know. We should use which type of GDP to evaluate the living standard and economic growth. The answer should be real GDP per capita. The reason is we should remember to adjust the change in price and population size when using GDP to evaluate the living standard and economic growth.